When the Arab Spring blooms in Beirut, it announces the time of roses in Damascus. This was one of the last words written by Samir Kassir, the Lebanese-Syrian-Palestinian journalist, activist, and historian and public intellectual who was one of the few voices of the Lebanese democratic left who was unwilling to compromise between supporting the Palestinian cause and opposing the Assad regime's brutality in Lebanon as well as in Syria. Kassir saw no compromise to be made there because the liberation of Palestine cannot be done without the liberation of Syria, and the liberation of Syria cannot be done without the liberation of Lebanon, and vice versa. To commemorate the 20 years since he was assassinated by the Assad regime on the 2nd of June 2005, I sat down with Leila Al-Shami, my co-host of Syria the Inconvenient Revolution, as well as Ziad Majed, a friend of Samir Kassir and comrade who was also part of this new democratic left that was short-lived, largely because its leading intellectuals, including Kassir and George Howie, were assassinated, part of that series of assassinations as of 2005 in Lebanon by the Assad regime. This conversation is being published on both the Far East Times as well as Syria the Inconvenient Revolution, because we're both part of the FTP, or From the Periphery Media Collective. The best way to support us, as usual, is on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. A couple of more things before we get into this episode. I had Ziad Majed on the Far East Times 5 years ago, also on June 2nd, to commemorate what was then the 15-year commemoration of Kassir's assassination. So feel free to listen to that one for a more long-form interview and conversation on the legacy of Samir Kassir, mostly focusing on the Lebanese context. In this conversation, we of course mostly focused on the Syrian context, although we did speak about Lebanon and Palestine as well. The second thing is that on the day that we recorded, Ziad Majed, as well as Farouk Mardambey and Subhi Hadidi, released the second edition of the book Dans la tête de Bachar al-Assad, or In the Head of Bashar al-Assad, which is being released by Babel in French. We'll include the link in the show notes for those of you who speak French or can read French. As the title suggests, it offers a portrait of Bashar al-Assad, as well as obviously the regime that he led for 2 decades until his fall in December of 2024. If you're listening to this on the Far East Times feed, consider subscribing to Syria the Inconvenient Revolution for more conversations like this one that are Syria-focused but also global in their orientation. As always, thank you for listening and take care. So welcome everyone to a special crossover episode between the Far East Times and Syria the Inconvenient Revolution, 2 podcasts that are part of the From the Periphery Media Collective. I'm joined today by 2 guests, one of whom is a co-host, Leila Al-Shami. Hi Leila.
Hi everyone.
And our other guest is Ziad Majed. Hi Ziad.
Hi.
The reason for doing this episode is sort of twofold. On the one hand, we want to introduce listeners of Far East Times to this new podcast that we're doing, which is Syria focused. On the other hand, June 2nd is when we're going to release this, and it will mark 20 years since the assassination of Samir Kassir, a highly influential person that we'll get into in this episode. I will say that 5 years ago, as well on June 2nd, Ziad was on the Far East Times, and we talked about what was then 15-year commemoration of his assassination, reflecting on Samir Kassir. It was pretty detailed, so people can listen to that one if they want. But we'll do our best in this episode as well, so it's kind of self-contained as well. I guess we can start with first some intros on your part, Ziad, if that's okay, for those who haven't listened to that first episode, and we'll take it from there.
So I'm Ziad Majed. I'm a professor at the American University of Paris. I coordinate the Middle East Studies program. I moved to Paris in 2006. So it was like a few months after the assassination of Samir. And since that time, I've been working on Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine from Paris.
So Samir is he was of course a friend of yours and a comrade, and for me as someone who never knew him, was a very influential figure for various reasons that I hope we'll get into. I think we'll get into in this episode and explain why for those who don't know who he was. He was an intellectual who had multiple identities. He was Lebanese, of course, but he was also a Palestinian and Syrian from both sides of his parents. And he was one of the few, to my mind, kind of stubbornly principled intellectuals and writers and journalists who refused to compromise between supporting the Palestinian cause and opposing the Assad regime, which was a very difficult position to be in Lebanon at the time, today as well, but obviously not since the Assad regime collapsed. Yeah. I guess, yeah, given that we're going to releasing this in a few days, which will be June 2nd, which will of course mark 20 years since that day. If we can start with some reflections on your part on like how you take this how you want it, how you're going to commemorate that day, or how have you been thinking about it, and of course on Samir himself.
Yeah. Other than it's always an extremely sad day, and you always realize the loss of a friend, of a comrade, and of an intellectual who was committed, as exactly you said, to Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, to the question of democracy, but also to the question of liberation. He was capable of not making any sort of compromise between struggling against despotism and against colonial occupation. For him, they went in parallel, and they were always tied, and they were always connected. But in addition to that, maybe this year what is different is the fact that the Assad regime is not there anymore. We used to commemorate Samir's assassination while always thinking that the struggle against Assad will continue until a form of a political justice, let's say, is there before a real justice in court. But this time, there is something about a personal and public victory in the fall of the Assad regime when it comes to Samir and to many other assassinations in Lebanon. It's also about what he worked for, what he wrote about, the way he discovered Syria, in fact, through Syrian dissidents and Syrian opponents and intellectuals that did have a huge impact on his Lebanese commitment as well, on the fact that in Lebanon, he was, while opposing the Syrian hegemony and the Syrian regime, very keen on supporting the Syrian workers and rejecting all form of racism and discrimination that was targeting them. So I think it's a special year, of course, and with the fall of Assad, this is something to celebrate, not only to commemorate, but there is the genocide that is ongoing in Palestine, and there are all the difficulties in Lebanon that are not the same, but they still belong, let's say, to the same configuration of the Lebanese political system and its internal balances that Samir also wrote and worked to change and to reform.
Yeah, absolutely. Leila, I'll bring you in a sec. I wanted to first reflect a bit just on I was even trying to write a list of just the changes that have occurred in our region where we're from, basically, in the past 2 decades since that day, since 2005, since June 2nd, 2005 even. In 2006, and I'm just going to list some of them here. It's not even going to be comprehensive necessarily. But we had, of course, the other series of assassinations from 2005 onwards. Samir wasn't the first, he was the second, technically, after Hariri. 2006, of course, there was the big war between Hezbollah and Israel, which devastated Lebanon and in many ways was the beginning of what would later come as of last year. In 2008, we have a sort of a mini civil war in Lebanon. In 2011, of course, we have the Arab Spring, and for our purposes, the Syrian Revolution. Even before that, 2008, 2009, a first iteration of a big war on Gaza, and then 2014, another even much bigger one. And then, of course, ongoing, as you mentioned, the genocide. So that's like on the Israel-Palestine side. In Syria, 2011, as I mentioned, the revolution, it saw multiple iterations after that in terms of interventions from foreign actors. For our purposes, what is especially relevant is Hezbollah's intervention, of course, Iran and Russia and so on as well. But this is very relevant because Samir, as we've already said, was killed for that. He was the second person after the prime minister, the political assassination. And then the second one was this journalist. And there was something clearly about what he stood for that made him such a big threat. Of course, George Howie, the former secretary of the Communist Party, would be assassinated just a few weeks later, end of June 2005 as well. So it would be 20 years as well in this month. So, Leila, if I can bring you in a bit, there is a photo that was taken with you in it, and that was like end of 2005. And in that photo, which we'll release at some point as part of something we do, there is the portrait of Samir Kassir, because it was just like a few months after he was killed. And in fact, the photo that I'm using for the illustration, so as an illustration, for this episode, is basically that photo. What are your reflections on everything?
I mean, I think just reflecting that, so much has changed in the region, and people who were really fundamental to keeping the struggle for democratic rights alive, not only in the country where they were, but linking struggles across the region. You know, I just feel great sadness that so many of those people aren't here today to see the Assad regime fall. Of course, there's still so much work to do in Lebanon and in Palestine and also in Syria. But, you know, their absence is very greatly felt, I think, at this time.
So the photo, I didn't explain it to those who don't know, but why is that photo important, let's say?
Well, for me, the photo is important because there's so many of my friends in it that, you know, are no longer alive. I think the photo, there's a group of us, we're at Yassin al-Haj Saleh's house. And in that photo is Samira Khalil, Yassin's wife, who was imprisoned by the Assad regime for her activities in the Communist Party. And then during the revolution was very active and was kidnapped in Douma, along with 3 other people in the photo. One was Razan Zaytoune, who was a very close friend of mine, who I worked with for many years. She was a human rights activist who became one of the founders of the local coordination committees during the revolution. Also, her husband's, in some of the photos from that night, I think the photo you're thinking of, Wael, is actually behind the camera.
Yeah.
But again, he was very active during the revolution. There was Nazim Hamadi, who was a lawyer who I also worked with very closely and was very active during the revolution and was also kidnapped. So those 4 were kidnapped probably by Jaish al-Islam in Douma during the revolution. Then also in that photo was a very good friend of mine, Fares Morad, who was a Palestinian Syrian. He was also a communist, and he was in prison for 29 years in Syria. He'd been in Adra prison, Sednaya, Tadmor for his activities, and he was released from prison in 2004. And myself and Razan really befriended him. He was very ill. He was bent double. He had some bone disease, which he wasn't allowed to leave the country for treatment for. And sadly, he passed away not long after that photo was I think in maybe 3 or 4 years after that photo was taken, he ended up dying from his illness. There's 3 other people in that photo that I didn't know so well. One was Randa, who has translated many books, and totally by coincidence, I've not seen her for many, many years, but she's recently translated a book that I was working on. So there was a nice connection there. And her husband, Imad, who again was a communist, spent time in prison by the Assad regime. And then there's a friend of Yassin's called Shadi, who was there that evening, who wasn't politically active at the time, but he was in prison twice during the revolution and sadly died soon after his second release. So I think that photo just summarizes so much about the struggle that Syrians have been through, because it's such a long history of struggle. I think many people that came to Syria in 2011 think that this struggle against the Assad regime started in 2011, but it didn't. There's a long history of struggle. It goes back to my father's generation. And some of these people, they never gave up. They went through so many hardships. They sacrificed so much. They faced so many losses, but they really kept going. And you know, I wish that we could share this joy of the liberation with them, but at least I feel this is some kind of justice for them.
Absolutely. And I think also that this picture, because of what exactly Leila was saying, and because of the fact that many of the people found themselves later in exile, and then Imad died in exile, people in the pictures, some of them died inside Syria during the revolution, others are still alive, and that's the beauty of the story finally, and of the struggle that continues. And having Samir in the background also for a Lebanese or for a Palestinian, it reveals a lot. It says a lot about the fact that there is one criminal, in fact, connected to every single individual in this picture, the Assad regime. and that all of them are or were and continue to be, in some cases, part of the struggle against authoritarian regimes or against what the Assad incarnates as dictatorship, and for the Palestinian liberation and for the renaissance in the region that Samir was very concerned about. And I would just add one thing when we were talking about Samir, maybe this is more the Lebanese aspect of Samir, is that he was a Francophone, he was French speaking and wrote mainly in French, but he offered the way French is written in Lebanon something leftist, something new, because Francophonie in Lebanon was much more connected to a kind of Christian right-wing, politically conservative, even if socially it might have progressive aspects or characteristics, but politically was mostly on the right. Samir gave it some fresh air through his leftist political culture, through his Palestinian identity or part of his identity that is Palestinian. And I think that the fact that he was Palestinian and Syrian from his father and mother's side, that he was himself the product of Beirut as a cosmopolitan and as Arab city of culture, and the one that hosted dissidents and many intellectuals from the region. The fact that he was Mediterranean because he was very much also attached to Egypt and to the role that Egypt played in the Arab intellectual history, because he was French and very much attached to the French language. All of that gave him this possibility of being Lebanese, Syrian, Palestinian, French at the same time, without tensions and without artificial effort or without trying to prove all the time that those identities can coexist. And that for me is very important, especially today, with the rise of right-wing and far-right people always talking about identities as just being against each other. And even if he was very secular, but he was also, when it comes to the Lebanese context, Christian, who was born and who was raised in Ashrafiyeh, in what became, in the Lebanese civil war, Eastern Beirut, while politically he was closer to Western Beirut because of the Palestinian question and because of the leftist commitment. And then what I think made him politically mature is his friendship with especially two people, Farouk Mardambek, who is a Syrian intellectual that he met in France, and Elias Sambar, who is a Palestinian intellectual that he also met in France. And both of them were leading the Journal for Palestine Studies, where he worked. And that opened to him as well a window to the Arab world, to the questions that go beyond the Lebanese context and political situation. And that's why his presence in that picture for me was, even if the picture is very sad, and I keep looking sometimes when I see it, it continues to be very sad because all of the losses as well, the concentration of losses of lives that were destroyed in this picture. Nevertheless, it was a pleasant surprise, let's put it like that, to have him in the background as if he was spending also that lovely and beautiful evening with them.
And it was a beautiful evening because I remember there was lots of music and dancing, and my favorite picture from that night is actually a picture of Razan and Samira, and they're both dancing and smiling at the camera. The life was difficult, but people bring their own joy, and that's what you find in community, and you find in friendship, and you find in political struggle.
Absolutely.
I recognize a lot of what you two have been saying, especially Ziad. One of the things that I have this a bit random connection with Samir. As I said, I've never met him personally, but my 14th birthday was the day of his assassination. And there was also kind of this thing in the back of my mind because I also went to university with his nephew, and so there was kind of this, whatever kind of bond you might call it.
Yeah.
But I'm also someone who, this isn't as important for the purpose of this conversation, but I'm also part Palestinian. I grew up in a very middle class Lebanese, Maronite, etc. family. When I grew up, I went to this very private Catholic school, and it was like by default also like the Palestinian being the other. That's why I recognized a lot of those dynamics when I started reading Samir Kassir, which was a few years after he was killed, and I recognized those dynamics even though he was writing about them in a slightly different timeline, but not that removed time-wise. Samir, to kind of emphasize this to listeners who may not know, there's something very specific. Ziad illustrated some of it here already about the fact that he is Lebanese but is recognized by Syrians is not that common. as recognized as one of us kind of thing, or one of theirs, so one of them, so to speak. There's a graffiti that was drawn in Idlib, I believe, in 2019. So when Lebanon, end of 2019, when Lebanon was having its own kind of moment, its own uprising and revolution, which we discussed on the podcast as well a number of times, on the Fridays time specifically, since this is going on both podcasts. There's a graffiti artist in Idlib, which was at the time one of the non-Assad held territories in Syria, and it was one of the quotes by Samir Kassir, which was one of the texts, I believe, that one of the last texts that he wrote before he was killed. And the quote is, "When the Arab Spring blooms in Beirut, it announces the time of roses in Damascus." And this was in 2005. So like even the concept of the Arab Spring, of course, for most people would come 6 years later in 2011. The kind of the imagery of roses for me, I believe it was in Daraya, if I'm not mistaken, where they were handing water bottles and roses to soldiers, telling them like, kind of a peaceful uprising, part of the peaceful, the non-violent uprising.
It happened in Banyas and then in Daraya.
Banyas, you're right. Yeah. So I just want to kind of emphasize this, that there's something almost prophetic about how he was insisting on seeing the connections between Lebanon and Syria, which many Syrians were seeing and were writing, but on the Lebanon side, in my experience, which I said, it's like one generation removed, has, and to some extent remains, difficult to make those connections. There's a lot of people who just resist to make any kind of connections for various reasons.
There are two major factors also that today make it extremely difficult to build or to reconstruct normal, and before even talking about special, Lebanese-Syrian relations. You have the 29 years of Syrian regime's occupation of Lebanon, with all the assassinations and the manipulation and the corruption that came with. And then you have Hezbollah's involvement in the Syrian war in support of the Assad regime. So to find today theater of reconciliation and to evoke the past, and also to discuss the whole question of some Syrian elites for decades rejecting the Lebanese independence after it happened in the 40s. And then on the Lebanese side, racism and arrogance when it comes to the rest of the Arab world, but especially to Syria. All of that definitely will require lots of work among the intellectuals, militants, activists in both countries. But I'm sure it will happen one day. Maybe now there are in both countries extremely difficult conditions and lots of tasks and challenges, but soon it should happen, and it will happen.
There's always been moments when people have come together and joined together. And I remember one very significant event when I was living in Syria was the Beirut-Damascus Declaration of 2006, which was signed by many Syrian and Lebanese intellectuals and activists calling for improved relations between Syria and Lebanon, and Lebanese independence, and an end to political killings.
And I hope that these kind of maybe declarations could start again. We need them today because we do have lots of common challenges, whether related to the borders, related to how we do read the past, what future can we have. The Israeli challenge that is being imposed on both countries today through new forms of occupation and interventions, and the whole regional and international context that is changing and that is scary, in fact.
Well, it's interesting what you were saying about Samir Kassir's politics and his internationalism that was developed by his multiple identities, because now with the Syrian population, there's people who have been outside Syria now for many, many years, coming into contact with different political cultures, coming into contact, maybe they're in Europe, but they're also meeting other Arab diaspora populations. And I hope that this will create, or is creating, I'm sure it is creating, a new political consciousness, a new feeling of what internationalism is. And Syrians will return to Syria with that experience. So I think there's a lot of hope in this.
Yes.
Yeah, the situation is today, as you mentioned, it is pretty dire. I guess to explain some of it, again, this won't be necessarily all-encompassing, comprehensive, because that would be a much longer podcast. But of course, there is the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the ongoing settler colonialism by the Israelis, which has taken on different levels, I guess it's fair to say, in the past couple of years. The relationship between the Lebanese and Syrians, this is a broad generalization, but is still heavily impacted by especially those two factors that Ziad already mentioned, the Syrian occupation of Lebanon, of course, but existing and ongoing Lebanese xenophobia towards Syrians, and of course, well, three, I guess, and of course, Hezbollah's intervention in Syria, which did not help the matter, of course. The conflation, for those who don't know, among many Lebanese, I think of my grandmother, for example, anecdotally, of when they say Syrians, they think of the regime, but they also make no difference between the regime and refugees, for example, at the time. There's a lot of these things kind of playing out, and it will certainly take time to not just heal the wounds, but also like find some kind of common vision moving forward. The ongoing Israeli politics towards Lebanon and Syria, as you just mentioned, is basically that of occupation, and they have already trying to take more lands in Syria and of course in Lebanon. They're not really fully gone in southern Lebanon. There are questions as to what's going to happen in terms of Syria being forced to normalize because of the threats of sanctions and Trump and all of that stuff. So that's something we'll definitely explore more on Syria, the Inconvenient Revolution podcast. So there's a lot of these things kind of happening at the same time, which clearly doesn't bode well necessarily in terms of the short-term future. But it is important to recognize just how much has changed in the past 2 decades, and not all of it has been bad. The big one, of course, being the collapse of the Assad regime itself. Something that I would imagine was very difficult to imagine in 2005 when Samir was assassinated. I mean, we could barely believe it as it was happening, really. So I want to kind of bring that all in some sense as we slowly wrap up in many ways this brief but hopefully important commemoration of Samir Kassir and what he's meant. If you two have other reflections you want to share, please feel free to do so.
Yes, I would like to say that on the one hand, as it was mentioned, there are lots of challenges, and what is striking in the region today, and I keep thinking about it each time I go also to South Lebanon, but it was clear in our visit with Farouk Mardambek and Subhi Hadidi to Syria and to the Yarmouk camp, to Jawbar, all the images that we see from Gaza today, the amount and the level of destruction and the ruins that we are living we're living with them as if we are in this phase living with ghosts, living with destructions, physical destructions, sometimes political destructions. And all of that will be a huge challenge for many generations in order to rebuild, in order to not only repair what was damaged by the Assad regime, by the Israeli wars, but also to repair the landscape in which we live and to repair ourselves and our lives. That, I think, is a big challenge. But also when we went to Syria, as if we were bringing with us Samir, as if he was in that trip as well. And I would like to mention another friend that we lost, Elia, because the three of us were part of that experience or that adventure of the democratic left. And we worked together between 1994 and 2005, almost on all projects. Also, for me, it was sad that Elias Khouri passed away just before the fall of the regime.
Very shortly before.
Very shortly before. And many others, like Riyad Turk, like we mentioned Michel Kilo, we mentioned some other people. Maybe if all just lived for a few more months to see that historic day, the day of the fall of the regime, at least they could have witnessed some justice during their lifetime. And Giselle Khouri, Samir's wife, also left us before. That the visit to Syria, as if we carried them with us, and we wanted them to see what we were witnessing, the joy that the Syrians at the time, before maybe some terrible events that happened later, and before discovering as well the impact of decades of more than 50 years of Assadism, how damaging it was and how difficult it will be to overcome it and to rebuild the country. So at the time it was euphoric, and we just imagined them with us and with all the friends that we lost in Syria, in Lebanon, and in other places.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Leila?
Yes, I mean, I think we honor their memory by continuing the struggle. There's so much work to do still, and, you know, they would want that.
For sure. Deal, Leila.
Well, on that note, Ziad, thank you for joining us, and Leila, thank you for doing this as well.
It was a pleasure, and yes, we will continue definitely the work together.
Yes.
Absolutely.